I'm standing at the visitors entrance at United Nations headquarters in New York. A lot of people are here today. It's always busy out here, and one of the first things you see when you come in is a statue of Nelson Mandela, the first democratically elected president of South Africa. He's the only world leader that has his own statue here, and that gives you an idea of the high regard that he's held in throughout the world, and of course here at the United Nations. Well known for being a freedom fighter, someone who fought for social equality, someone who fought for human rights, but also a fighter for poverty. Now, it's also busy here at the moment because I'm speaking during the high-level political forum. This is a kind of global stocktake of the Sustainable Development Goals for a better future for people and the planet. And the very first of those goals is ending poverty. So to find out more about the importance of ending poverty to Mandela, I spoke to Richard Stengel. He worked very closely with Mandela on his autobiography, A Long Walk to Freedom. That's coming up on this week's episode of UN Weekly.
I remember when I used to hang around with him, and he loved seeing children and talking to children, and he would always, when he'd meet a child, he would always say the same thing. He would bend down and say, "And what did you have for breakfast today?" And by the way, if you've ever seen the most still 4 or 5 year old African boy or little girl, it's Nelson Mandela bending down and asking, "What did you have for breakfast today?" But it was a question about poverty, really. It was, were you getting enough to eat? If you don't have enough to eat, you can't learn in school. You can't do all of these other things. You can't eventually be a contributing member of society. And he had a lovely line, which was, freedom doesn't mean anything if you can't fill your stomach. And so I think in order of the things that he was trying to accomplish, one was to bring democracy to South Africa. And then I think he thought that would be a way of helping to alleviate poverty because it would rectify the injustices of the apartheid system. You know, what we know now is all these years later, there's still hunger in South Africa. There's still inequality. There's still inequity. And so it isn't a one-size-fits-all solution.
He had achieved democracy. He did eventually achieve power. To what extent was he thinking about it then? I mean, was redistribution of wealth part of what he was doing? Or then did the focus become ensuring that there would not be conflict, ensuring that there would be this peaceful transition of power?
So it's a good question, and it has a complex answer. And one of the things that he was very, very proud about was the creation of the ANC's Freedom Charter in 1955. It was before he even went to prison. And one of the tenets of the ANC Freedom Charter was redistribution of the wealth. And there's a line in it, the wealth that's under the ground in South Africa belongs to all South Africans. And they, wanted to nationalize the mining companies. By the time he came out from prison, it was just a year after the Berlin Wall had fallen, and these, old ideas of the Freedom Charter definitely seemed like old ideas. And he adapted pretty quickly to that and figured out how can we, what's the engine of prosperity in a free South Africa? And it wasn't nationalization, wasn't even a kind of a more modified socialism. It was trying to make things work, and that would be the engine of alleviating poverty. And of course, that hasn't been a perfect fit either.
Let's turn to you now. I mean, your interest in this area of ending poverty. You're one of the co-chairs on the board of Care International, the very well-known NGO, which has as its goal to end poverty. How did you get involved in that?
So after I was editor of Time, I went to work for Barack Obama at the State Department as Undersecretary of State for Public Affairs and Public Diplomacy. And even though fighting poverty wasn't part of my remit, it was something that I had always cared about. We had done, fighting poverty covers when I was at Time. And with that election of 2016, I wanted to do something that felt like it was doing something positive for the world, and I went on to the CARE board. Alleviating poverty is one of the core missions of CARE, which interestingly was formed the same time as the UN. UN was 1945, CARE was 1946. It's this part of that great post-war creation of institutions that have kept the rule of law, kept the peace, I would argue, for 75 or 80 years. And one of the ways that CARE fights poverty is in part through empowering women and girls. We have a focus on women and girls. We have all kinds of programs from, women farmer business school to helping, women in agriculture and helping women doctors, and to which has the net effect of making communities more prosperous by empowering women. So that's the particular lens through which CARE sees it, and we've been working on that for all these years.
And as you said, you were at Time magazine, you were the managing director of Time. And yes, you said yourself, you had poverty on the cover, issues of poverty that were very central to the editorial on many occasions. And there was, many people might remember this, the Mirror edition, when the person of the year was you.
Yes. Yeah.
And I was just wondering, is part of that this idea that we all have a responsibility to end poverty, to end inequity, to make the world a better place? Was that part of the philosophy behind that?
You're giving me the best possible benefit of the doubt there. That person of the year was really about the rise of user-generated content. That you're creating the new information economy.
We're all famous for 15 minutes.
Yes, and I guess when Jon Stewart made fun of me for holding the cover up to my face, I was famous for 15 minutes there. But it's an interesting point, because it is much more about self-empowerment for everybody. I mean, I'm still an internet exceptionalist, and think that part of the power of the internet is it allows people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do, whether it's start businesses, whether it's to get educated. And so that idea was that the internet allows you to control it rather than you be controlled by the internet, which is what people seem to think is the status quo right now.
Right. Interesting you say that, because of course you wrote the book on this, didn't you, on fighting misinformation. And I've seen some interviews with you before where you were extremely concerned about this area. So I'm interested that you say that overall you have a positive view of the internet.
I still do, and I even have a positive view of social media. And I got interested in disinformation when I was at the State Department and saw the rise of ISIS and how they used dis and misinformation, and particularly the Russians' use of it, because that was the original invasion of Ukraine with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And I hadn't really seen that kind of Russian infrastructure of disinformation, the fire hose of falsehood, as somebody called it, before. And that led me to start investigating it, and I ended up writing a book about it. And but I do think, it's the sort of thing where individuals everybody has a role to play, and part of that is in being sussing out disinformation from correct information, using kind of better information hygiene individually.
Media literacy.
I mean, there's no gigantic overarching solution. And part of the reason I'm still a kind of internet exceptionalist is that there's always been mis and disinformation ever since there's been information. And so I don't even know that the percentage of it has even changed over time, although people think that's crazy. What has changed is ease of access. And that makes it seem even bigger than it probably is.
So the amount of information we are bombarded with on a daily basis.
Yes, I mean, there's way more good and true information too.
Well, let's just bring it back to Nelson Mandela. To me, it's been a big part of my life. Mandela, I remember where I was when he was released from jail and when he became president. But it occurs to me that many listeners are perhaps too young to remember Mandela. So for those who don't know, what in your mind is the main thing that made him exceptional, and why are we still celebrating him today?
The thing that made him exceptional is that he was a lifetime freedom fighter against one of the most iniquitous systems of racial oppression the world has ever known, which was apartheid in South Africa. And South Africa wasn't alone. I mean, there was colonialism in Africa where there was a kind of a white supremacy. And he fought against that. He spent 27 years in prison. He pledged his life to fight against it. He almost went to the gallows, and said, I have fought racial oppression, white against black, black against white, and it is an ideal I hope to live for and achieve. And if needs be, it's an ideal for which I'm prepared to die. That was his famous speech from the dock at the Rivonia trial, where he was sentenced to life in prison, went to Robben Island and other prisons. And he's an incredible model of selflessness and courage in pursuit of, the goals of humanity. Freedom, equality, and anti-poverty.
And finally, like I said, you had a lot of talks with him. You knew him very well. He was very important to your life as well. As we go forward in time, we tend to just forget the details about people. They can become like these mythical figures. But as someone who knew him as a person rather than as a symbol, what would you say is one thing that really stuck out for you of him as an individual?
I was thinking about it today and thinking about when I first met him, and he was very sunny. I mean, this is a man who he'd only been out of prison for a year and a half when I met him, and he had this disposition that was optimistic. When he walked into a room, the room seemed lighter. When he left a room, the room seemed darker. There was something special about him in that way. I mean, I think the word charisma is wildly overused, but he actually had it.
You've been listening to UN Weekly with me, Conor Lennon. The editor was Jan Rambau. The executive producer was Mita Hassali. UN Weekly is a UN News production.